Welcome back to Careers Explained. Today we're talking with Andrew Wilkins about his career path and current role. He got his bachelor's degree from Davidson College in political science, and after graduating, he worked as a staff assistant in the U.S. Senate, as an assistant to the executive director for the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and as a government relations representative for the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. He is currently the Director of Land Conservation Policy at the National Wildlife Federation. Welcome, Andrew, and thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see you.
Can you start by describing in college what your original career interests were?
Yes, I can. So I can even get back before college. I really wanted to be a marine biologist when I was a little kid. I think that was just like liking beach and oceans and animals and things, but set that aside and actually became really interested in political science and security and defense. My dad was in the Army, and so I was never interested in joining the military, but I was kind of interested in like why these broader things happen and studying international dynamics and things like that.
Awesome. And then once you were leaving college, you've had a variety of different roles since then, but can you go over kind of what were the biggest similarities and differences between those roles you've had?
The very first thing I did out of college was my dad ran for U.S. Congress. He ended up not winning. There's not a Congressman Steve Wilkins, though I think he would have been better than most of the folks there. That was the first thing I did right out of college. I did a little stint also helping do some community news and writing for davidsonnews.net, which was kind of fun and a good way to practice talking with people, trying to learn a little bit about, what's going on in the community. But I was interested in the political process more. That kind of continued. So I went and worked for Senator Kay Hagan's office in North Carolina. A lot of senators have state offices, senators and members of Congress. I had never really considered that, but it was such an incredible way to learn the way that the legislative process impacts people directly. So, I was taking meetings, a lot of writing letters and answering phones as a junior staffer will do, and learning a lot about the issues, but I did get to dig in a little bit. And then after she lost, which was a huge disappointment. She lost in the what year was it? 2014 elections, and then I moved up here to DC.
What kind of motivated you to switch from the traditionally poli sci into more advocacy work in conservation?
Sure. Yeah, I worked. My last campaign job was at the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and I really enjoyed it. But I got a little bit of exposure both just through living here in DC and through some of the different organizations we worked with, to the nonprofit and policy advocacy side. And so it's really funny. I studied defense in college primarily, a lot of East Asian studies. I wrote my seminar thesis on like the Chinese Navy's modernization and all that stuff. But I've always kind of felt a personal calling to conservation issues and to the outdoors. And I was kind of at a fork in the road. You really have to commit to advancing in a campaign career path. That can mean, just picking up stakes and moving to Iowa, and then being there for a year and then moving to maybe Colorado and then, back to North Carolina or wherever. And that's wonderful if that's what you want to do. But I really wanted to settle down and dig into a set of issues. So I applied for a job at the Nature Conservancy, and believe it or not, I found that job on one of those DC job message boards. So I both love and hate to report they work, and you can get a job off of those, and you should continue pursuing those when you apply for jobs. Like cold application, I did not know anyone at the Nature Conservancy. I got extremely lucky.
So kind of you wanted to stay in one place as opposed to sort of move all over to move up with campaigns. Mm-hmm. And as you were in those different roles along the way, were there qualities of a job in conservation that you didn't want or did want as you were looking?
Yeah, so for me, I am really interested. I appreciate, the conservation community is literally one big ecosystem. There's a lot of different things that are important to it. There's, the advocacy roles, the fundraising to help, fuel all of these operations. And then the policy and advocacy side here in DC was what I was primarily interested in. I grew up backpacking and fishing and hunting, and I did Davidson Outdoors, and I was in college as well, which is this really cool outdoors program that runs trips all throughout the year, all seasons, all over. I through those activities and connections kind of thought, what I would really like to do would be trying to find common ground with members of Congress, with their staff on both sides of the aisle. Even though I have my personal politics, I had kind of thought that conservation and nature was one of the final frontiers that could kind of unite folks. And so that's why I pursued this sort of longer term path. There were opportunities along the way to get back to the Hill, and that's an important thing. You can do this as a detour or to learn and pick up a skill set and go back, but I've just sort of really enjoyed that sort of coalition building and consensus building aspect of the policy space. So that's primarily what I focused on is the policy side of it. And it's a little bit wonky. It's fun. It happens at random hours, as you've probably seen with the news alerts when they come in on your phone, whatever Congress is doing. But I really enjoy that dynamic.
Yeah, really doing something that means a lot to you, the fulfillment there of policy, but about an issue that you're personally connected to.
Yeah, it gives you something. It can help pull you through like the slow times too, like remind you, or you can, there's a lot of good touchstones to stay grounded with.
Your why. And once you found the job posting on the postings that do work, we have now heard, what were the steps to get this job?
Sure. Yes. That very first job with the Nature Conservancy, I think I found it on like Tom Manito's Jobs or something. It's like a paid job service here in DC. DC job hunters will be very familiar with it. I think striking a balance on when to follow up. And you don't want to just apply and let it go. Right. I find that those applications, just through both observation and as someone who's hired people before, they just tend not to. Just because you get so many applications, you have to do a little something to make yourself stand out, but you don't want to overdo it. So that was a big key to it. And with the Nature Conservancy too, you really have to figure out a way, every job you apply for is super unique. So, for me, I actually found that folder somewhat recently because I was looking for I don't remember what I was looking for, but something in my Dropbox. I think I had like 40 or 50 different resumes during that time. I crafted a new one each time to apply for something. And so in that case, for the Nature Conservancy, I knew exactly what they were looking for. I knew the structure of the organization and had a little idea of how I would fit in. And I went from there, and it was an entry-level job. And so presenting myself as a learner and someone interested in sort of, fitting in and being helpful is, my personal opinion. Maybe it's because it's worked, maybe it's because I like working with those folks. But when you're getting started, that kind of humility and that kind of understanding that you're getting started, but still having a little bit of initiative. It's a balance, but the balance between those two things seems to be best.
Definitely. You're walking the talk. So clearly something went right with the resumes or the follow-up. So now can you describe kind of an overview of both that original role, entry level, and what you do as a director?
Sure. So when I worked at the Nature Conservancy, a lot of that work did involve a lot of writing, a lot of research, and a whole lot of self-starting, because it's kind of like it's odd in an entry-level job. You are given pretty specific tasks, and you're pretty, that's probably when you're going to be the most directly managed in your career, no matter what it is you do. But at the same time, you kind of have to look out for ways you can jump in and what you can do to sort of move in the direction you want to go. And I'm lucky that I'm there, but that's something that I tell everyone is, your entry-level job is not going to be perfect. So at the whole time, you kind of have to have this motivation of, where do I want to go with this? When you're learning how to drive a car, right? Like they tell you not to look right in front of the car, or else you'll like swerve off the road or something. Like you have to like look ahead when you're getting started. And that was really helpful for me at the Nature Conservancy, because what I wanted to do, and what I learned a lot from the sort of more active folks going to the Hill, meeting with members of Congress and their staff, I just kind of watched and listened, asked if I could tag along every now and then, asked if I could help write something, watched how this stuff worked, made some mistakes along the way, didn't, get too beat up about it, learned from it. And, eventually through, had another job in between the Nature Conservancy and here. I worked for a group called the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, which was my first like direct sort of, it was a lobbyist job, frankly. I was lobbying for nature, for trees and fish and stuff. And, the skills I learned there eventually led me to where I am now. I'm the director of land conservation policy at the National Wildlife Federation, which is an organization. It's kind of a dream come true. That was one of those things that I actually remember when I was a kid. Like, if you're familiar with Ranger Rick and like the little zoo books and all the little nature books that kids get, that's the National Wildlife Federation. And so now I get to do that, and it's been a lot of fun.
And between those different roles, kind of why did you leave at the times you did, and what made you choose each organization?
Yeah, that is a really hard one. I think I tend to be a little bit more pragmatic about sort of the job space. You don't owe an employer anything but your best work, but you don't owe them your time, and you don't owe them your future. So like it's very important. When I was at the Nature Conservancy, it was important for me to do a good job, but I was only there for about a year. But because of my prior political experience, all that stuff kind of rolled together, for me to think it was time to go and find a place I could grow more. And I think that was kind of what has motivated each of my decisions, is not like being tired of the job and not being burned out. And I'm very fortunate in that regard too. But looking for a place to grow, looking for a place that has more opportunities, or maybe slightly different projects that I can work on to continue growing my skill set, because I want to work in this space long term. Maybe that's at the National Wildlife Federation for a long time. I don't know. I hope so. My colleagues are great, but that's why I switched over to the Federation, is because it's a team I'd worked with a lot. I think they do great work, and I wanted to be a part of it.
And now for the director role here, what was the training like? Obviously, you'd had your prior roles, but was there any formal training for this?
No, no training at all for this one. And in fact, I'll say that the only time I have had any training at all, gosh, I don't actually think I got any on the job, like formal training in that sense for any of my jobs in the conservation field, which is wild. You certainly get like the standard, like, this is how you are an employee in this company training, but like no skill training. It was all like really like teaching someone to swim by throwing them in the pool and seeing what happens. It's completely wild. So yeah, no training at all. A lot of teaching myself, and like a lot of I learned a lot of good lessons from mentors along the way, and people are just like good at this work about how to, for instance, like I try and build advocacy campaigns or join advocacy campaigns, and sometimes that is learning how to identify the best member of Congress or find the right angle to lobby for a specific bill. But it can also mean, how do you write legislation or suggest edits to improve its likelihood of passing? And a lot of that has just been learned along the way. And also, a special shout out to the entry-level political science courses at Davidson for teaching me about the political process, because that's actually pretty static, even though it has varying degrees of dysfunction due to the personalities. Like, the machine is there at least. And so knowing how that works, and a lot of, there are a lot of technical questions that I have to answer on my own. And I think a big difference between, a good lobbyist or congressional staff or just general person working in the policy advocacy space, and what I hope to be, which is a really good one, is someone who sees a snag in the process or sees something they don't understand, and they just take the time to like comprehensively research and learn how it works. There's a lot of people who don't know how all these different processes work, and who just kind of, for better or for worse, defer to someone else to do it for them. For me, I just like knowing how to do it, and that has helped me, be a little bit more, I guess, flexible and, I guess, nimble with all these different advocacy campaigns here.
Yeah, with no training, especially, you really need to be a self-starter from the get-go. But also then if you want to exceed in that expectation, doing something that helps you stand out. And so now as you're in your role of director of land conservation policy, can you give kind of a brief overview of what you do in that role specifically?
Sure. I guess since I've talked a lot about it, sort of the Hill side of it, I'll start there. I mean, a lot of what I do is speaking with both members of Congress and their staff and also the administration. They have a huge role to play in the passage and implementation of conservation policy. And so a lot of that's just like listening and learning and understanding what's happening in DC and why. The why part is what, makes that is definitely a separation. That's the dividing line between the news, like reading a newsletter that comes in every morning and like providing a valuable service to my colleagues and to our members, both individual members like you or me that wants to be a part of the National Wildlife Federation, but more importantly, or just as importantly, should I say, in case anyone from development's listening, but just as importantly are our state affiliates. The National Wildlife Federation is made up of an affiliate from every single state, every territory. Some states have multiple affiliates. And for me, what I'm trying to do is not only advance policy priorities identified here at the national level, but learn and listen about what's happening and affecting them from their state delegation so they can know how to be helpful, but also how I can maybe tap them as a resource to help out with lobbying and advocating for something. So that's one element of what I do. When you get more senior in the nonprofit space, another important part of your work is it is a nonprofit. So a lot of funding for this work does come from grants and foundations, or maybe from, a collection of large donors, whether that be, company or an individual or something. So a part of what I do is management of that and reporting back to the folks who want to support our work, who share our vision about what conservation should look like in America, and keep them posted both on what's happening and about where we're going. That way they can make their decisions about what to do next. I mean, that's the business end of it. But as you get more senior, it's really important to understand, the reporting requirements, how to write a grant, how to review a grant, how to respond to a funder, what to communicate, all that stuff has been something that, again, no training, I've learned on the fly by observation. But that's a big part of my job, and it's a big part of the nonprofit advocacy side as well. Again, on really any sector, whether it's conservation, healthcare, human rights, we don't make money, doing this as an organization. We're purely in the policy and the advocacy business. And so that has been a challenge for me personally to learn more about, not because it's like particularly hard, but because it's just not something you have any exposure to until you have to. And it says, so for this job, it was a brand new position. This position didn't exist before I applied for it. I learned about it from someone I knew at the Federation, and they encouraged me to apply. And so I've kind of gotten to build out what this role means, what this policy center means. And right now I've been sort of drafting some new ideas and working on some new out of the box thinking for conservation policy going forward. So a lot.
A lot. And then understanding how those variety of roles and responsibilities map onto your usual schedule. Can you walk through either a day or a week, whatever seems more logical, for how those roles break down into your schedule?
Sure. A big part of that, I'm trying to think, because I'm a serious calendar person. I really rely on my calendar to get me through all of these responsibilities and try to be very proactively organized, which I would absolutely not make it if I wouldn't. This stuff just really stacks up. But I would say my week is kind of a balance of those things, that I talked about, talking to the Hill, working on sort of the administrative business side of it, and then maybe the drafting and collaborative sort of generating new ideas. It's honestly divided into thirds throughout the week. All of those things I try and manage proactively. When you want anyone to do anything, whether it's your neighbor, a family member or a friend or a business partner, or in this case, a member of Congress, it's really helpful if you talk to them before you want something. And so I try to spend a lot of my time just going to meet with staff and just staying connected with them, both updating them on what we're doing, asking them about what their priorities are in this space, and just sort of trying to stay connected. I heard from friends. I was never in a senior policy role on the Hill, but friends who currently are and have been, they hate it when someone just shows up out of nowhere and says, either gets really mad, or sometimes even more perplexingly is they're super excited about something they did. And they're like, who are you? Like, that's great. Thank you. But like, who are you? Like, okay, awesome. So I try to avoid that. And I spend a lot of time corresponding with the Hill. And because I live here in DC, going to meet with them directly. So that's one thing. The administrative side of it is just really, there's no exciting way to talk about it. I just have to like block off time and do that like incrementally, write a little bit, put it down. There are folks in the nonprofit space. This is not a career that interests me, and I'm so glad there are people who work full-time on development. And I really defer to them and trust their expertise on like what needs to be done and the timelines on that. The size of the organization dictates how many of those people there are. So like I used to work for a really small organization. It was just one person. And so there was a lot more work that I was doing. Now at a big organization, they kind of like schedule the check-ins for you, and they are fully engaged. And in fact, we have it split up into different centers. So like we have our own person who helps manage it, which is awesome. They're incredible. Thank God they exist. And then like the last part is a little bit more ad hoc, but the drafting of policy and working with my colleagues, to make sure what we're doing is in line with both our mission and what the broader conservation community is working on. There are just like lots of calls and meetings throughout the week. Sometimes I'm listening to them, sometimes I'm leading them, but either way, I'm trying to listen and sort of stay abreast of what others are doing and making sure that, when necessary, I'm connecting with them to make sure my work is sound. Like I want to be sure it's scientifically sound if we're doing anything, related to land. One thing I'm working on is a conservation proposal to try and prioritize land to receive federal and state incentives for conservation. I want to make sure that how we're developing those criteria makes sense. And I'm not a scientist. I'm not a wildlife biologist. So sometimes that means scheduling calls with the science team. They are super cool. They know so many amazing things about wildlife and about ecosystems and, how they all work. But that's just one example of that final third, the drafting things. There's just a lot of talking and swapping paper.
Yeah, the research isn't necessarily Googling things, but often talking to experts in those designated fields, just like with the grants, going to people who are specialists and working from there.
Yeah.
And on that idea of sort of the collaborative nature of the role, what does your team look like of who you work with regularly?
Sure. I work with a lot of internal and external folks, which is really fun. Internally, there are lots of other experts at the National Wildlife Federation. They're all really, there's a water policy team who monitors, water policy, obviously. But, right now we're working on issues such as Chesapeake Bay conservation, Everglades restoration, some designations of national marine sanctuaries. So like all that's in their purview. We have a sort of Western team because Western issues manifest themselves differently than Eastern. So we're thinking like high Rocky Mountain sort of areas. And so they help manage sort of the public lands aspect of that and how people interact with it. We've got all these different policy teams. My personal team is the private lands team that I'm attached to, even though I wear a lot of different hats that fit outside of it, just sort of due to the unique nature of my position. But the private lands team, most of the conservation in the United States is actually done by private landowners. It's done through the conservation title of the Farm Bill, which is up for reauthorization this year. It's not just agriculture, and it's not just supplemental nutrition assistance programs either, which is another very important part of the Farm Bill. There's just a lot of conservation stuff that happens in there. And I am actually not a Farm Bill specialist. So me being on the Farm Bill team is a little interesting. But part of why I'm on this team is because those are the internal partners, but externally, I work with lots of other conservation organizations on a daily basis to build broader coalitions to support legislation and sometimes oppose it. So right now I'm partnering with Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, Natural Resources Defense Council, World Wildlife Fund, Audubon, and we're all building these coalitions. And one of one of the things I just really enjoy is identifying our shared priorities and as well as our unique talents, and trying to help guide the coalition on when to weigh in. Sometimes for the same bill, it is super helpful for Audubon to speak to a member of Congress and super unhelpful for us to, just because of the dynamics. It boils down even to who the member likes, like it can be that it can be as simple as someone thinks herons are super cool and therefore they only want to talk to the Audubon Society, just as it can be the only way that anyone cares about something is because they're an avid hunter. They go duck hunting every year. And so they see these things, climate change playing out in the wetlands and marshes they hunt. So the external partnership side of it is super fun. I would offer that might be one of my specializations with the National Wildlife Federation, is sort of the community and coalition work. I tend to focus most of my energy there. And I think that's kind of what I bring to the table, for us.
Understanding the people, their interests, and then the broader policy interests there.
Right.
And part of your specialty, then I'm guessing that's probably one of the things you like most about the job, but curious from your perspective, what are your favorite things about the job and what do you find challenging?
Yeah, I mean, definitely one of my favorite things about the job are these sort of amazing coalitions and sort of shared projects we build in those moments when you go in to talk about a bill and they say, it says here both, like, I just said, like, Ducks Unlimited and like this super liberal lefty organization, you guys are all here for the same bill. And we're like, yeah, we are. Like, this matters and there's so much common ground. That's one of my favorite things to have happen. I also do get to be a part of passing really big signature conservation legislation, which is really, really fun. One of the funniest things about bills, and I think Hollywood is to blame for a lot of this, is they make it seem like one person is the key to a bill passing, but that's actually really, really rare here. Now, there's obviously going to be like one final touch, whoever takes the final action that pushes it across the finish line. I mean, sometimes you can pinpoint that, but by and large, I really love knowing the things I've been a part of and the things I've helped pass. I mean, you can kind of see that stuff starting to go to ground out literally in the wild. One of the biggest bills I've worked on in a long time, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, worked on the Land and Water Conservation Fund authorization, and that preserves, it helps state governments and nonprofit entities join forces, and I'm really watering this down, but basically to buy and eventually transfer land to the federal government for permanent preservation and conservation. And getting out on some of those landscapes and seeing that is super special, and like it's super meaningful to hear about those projects. One got finalized in South Carolina recently in a partnership with a group called Quail Forever, and that I'm going to get to go there probably next fall, not this fall. I'm a little bit busy. I'm getting married next spring and planning a wedding. It's like a lot of work, so trying to minimize the travel. But I mean, I think those are some of the coolest things, to be totally honest. And some of the challenges is just Congress just does what it wants sometimes. I mean, the hardest challenges are the things that don't happen for no good reason. I mean, it's just because they ran out of time, because a completely unrelated issue, which is really important, they dealt with that first, like an issue that I fully support, but it means, at the expense of what, there's only limited floor time. No matter what your political philosophy is, there are limited dollars to be spent. There's disagreements on how much should be spent, but you can only spend and appropriate and authorize a certain amount in a year. And it can be really tough to see the same programs I advocated for go unfunded or only get half of their funding. And by and large, I would say more often than not, stuff doesn't happen because we just ran out of time. And that's really tough. I mean, there was a huge bill that's what happened with it last Congress, the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's incredible. It would change the game for conservation in the United States. We're optimistic we'll get it done this year, but last year we just ran out of time. There was no good reason why it had majority support in both chambers. They just ran out of time to finalize the deal, and then you start all over. That's how it works. When after 2 years, everything's wiped clean. You have new members. And you have to start not from scratch. The idea is there, the people is there, the passion are there, but like, it's back to like not quite zero, but like pretty close to it process wise. So that's tough.
Yeah. Well, then congratulations on those that you have passed and for those that are coming, and as well as your wedding. Lots of wins there. And
Yeah.
you described sort of a trend in your career was looking for opportunities where you could grow. And sometimes that was at a different role and sometimes organization. At your current organization, what are the opportunities for moving up?
Sure. Well, I think that, here's probably like the coldest take out of anyone you've talked to. Congress is a little bit divided these days. And so I think that one of the biggest opportunities for me is to continue sort of being a community builder and being proactive and finding things in common. It's not that my colleagues don't do that. They're exceptional at that. It's just, having the capacity to focus on that is something that I think is going to be really great for me at the National Wildlife Federation. I'm having colleagues that support that. I also work like at a really good place. National Wildlife Federation is a very supportive workplace. It's a very lowercase p progressive workplace too, which makes working there really enjoyable. So I want to stick around, and I think that there's folks who want to help me continue to like build and grow those interests, and navigating and building and finding, I guess, odd partners to get things done. It's what it takes. We know who the traditional supporters and opponents of environmental and conservation issues are now. It's pretty clear. It's finding connections between those groups or through some other group that's been overlooked for whatever reason, that we have to keep doing. And it's fun to be a small part of that.
Yeah, bringing people together for a common goal. And for those who want to help in that process of bringing people together to conserve nature, what advice would you have for current students or recent grads who want to kind of follow into this field?
Yeah, I would say, like I mentioned at the very beginning, it is, man, sounds like a terrible cliche, but I mean, it really is like one big ecosystem. And I think knowing what role you want to play in that is super helpful. I mean, if you are really fired up about getting people fired up, or once they already are, organizing them, we need in this space people organizing grassroots folks and sort of harnessing that energy into change and into appropriate noise or action to keep this moving. That's a pretty well-known, I think, element of the environmental movement. But some of the lesser known elements of it and the things that are so important are folks with a science background are needed in the policy space. So like if you are super interested in wildlife biology, we need you here too, because I don't know that stuff and I need more people who do. I think that's critically important. I also think too, people who are solutions oriented in any way, there's a place for them in this space too. You can be a super broad generalist, which I kind of am, or you can be very interested in a specific issue, like converting our grid to a greener one and a more sustainable one. One of the issues that I actually work on a lot in my space and continue to learn a lot about is the role of the environmental justice movement in private lands conservation, and the way that all of these land conservation programs are inaccessible, oftentimes deliberately, to the communities that need them the most. And so there's a justice angle to this too. It's not my specialty either. And so I have to lean on the knowledge of a lot of my colleagues and other groups to do that. But I mean, just there are so many different angles that you can approach this space. The one piece of advice I do have about like really nuts and bolts of getting a job is you need to, when you're getting started, you kind of need to go where the work is happening. So if you're interested in the policy space, you do need to find a way to come to DC. And that's tough. This is an expensive town. It's far away from a lot of folks' homes. And did I mention it's an expensive town? So that's like one element of it. But, if you're interested in the wildlife biology side of it, DC and other things will be there for you. Like, get out in the field and get that experience, because those folks, we really lean on them and defer to their knowledge about, how to actually, we're all excited about it. We've got people here in DC with the connections on the Hill, but like, what do we do? So, I mean, just go to where the work is. It sounds kind of dumb, but I mean, like, it really does make a huge difference. I mean, for me, just moving to DC, was a game changer for me in getting a job here. I know I was lucky to be able to do that, but it helped.
Interesting. So first understanding the ecosystem, then understand where you might be a good fit, get experience that would make you a value add, and then pursue it in DC.
Yeah, all very easy stuff. All
Nice.
easy to do.
It's easier with a roadmap. So thank you for going over it, because a lot of people wouldn't know any of that. So I appreciate all the insights as well as your career path.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing. In the Davidson, we're both Davidson alums, but a lot of other networks. There's a lot of other people have way more networks than just whatever their education background is. Whatever their education background is, ask for things. I mean, really ask someone for help. I mean, I can't tell you the number of stories I hear in town where someone's most valuable connection is a random alumni that they found and sent them a note, and they've stayed in touch, or maybe they even haven't stayed in touch. That's even more amazing thing, is like they were just connected to someone through some life path they previously went down, and people want to help. Like they really do. And you're going to send so many emails that don't go answered. But if you send enough, someone will get back to you, and it'll fall into place. That's how I got here. And I promise you, I answer my emails when people ask for help. So
there
I
are
highly
people
recommend
who
it.
help and answer. So keep shooting until you make one in terms of networking.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I wish there was something like this when I was applying for jobs. I was totally winging it.
Yeah.
But this is a really cool project. Thanks for having me. It's an honor.